income tax continually rises. There's going to be a lot of people clue into this. They're going to say, why live in Nova Scotia? Pay the high taxes. I can use that money and I can enjoy the money. So why do that? And I didn't even realize it until I talked to my friend. I talked to my friend about that, and these people are Nova Scotians that are leaving the province for that. And it makes you wonder, why? Well, it's our tax structure. It's our tax structure. Well, I'm talking about the bill here, because it goes through the process, all the democratic process, right? And you know, if we don't keep up the process here, you're not going to have to worry about anybody voting here, because there's not going to be many people left. We're going to have less than 1 million people here in the province. Our aging population. So if the aging population here that has enough income that they can travel south, and there's a lot of people that do, and a lot of people that don't. But the ones that do, with the disposable income that they do make a difference in the economy here, decide that it's not worth living in Nova Scotia anymore, and they move to Ontario, or even better, for tax purposes, to Alberta, and they travel south or travel wherever they travel the rest of the year, realize that they can actually have more disposable income without having an increase in their income. So it doesn't take much time or much thought to figure this out. And once this happens, as the population gets older and older, and you get into this thing, and you see what happens. Then we lose the people that vote. We lose our voters, because most of the older people in the province are the people that vote. And when they see the process, and they don't vote, so you're going to have lower turnout again in voting, a lower turnout again. So then the people that do vote are going to have more of an influence put on them by the ads that are run by people that have the money to run the ads. That's what we're talking about here. We're talking about being able to buy an election. And that very possibly could happen to this bill if the proper things aren't put in place. And, you know, the Minister of Service Nova Scotia is shaking his head. And he's the same guy that told me it's $100,000 to hire an auditor for the municipalities, all 50, well, 51 of the municipalities, because HRM has already got their own, $100,000 a year for an auditor. Well, the members should check with our Auditor General and see what kind of credentials, number one, you need to be a provincial an auditor. It's actually quite substantial credentials you have to have. A CA is one thing, but then you have to take other training to be an auditor. And indeed, you're not even going to hire an auditor for $100,000 a year. Never mind the support staff, the traveling to go to all the municipalities over the period of time. And do that, you're probably going to be looking at $1 million, $2 million a year to do this and do it properly. So, you know, as you see these things fading away, and the government's misdirection on a lot of these bills and the things that are happening, it questions more of this bill here. So what's in this bill that we don't understand yet? We will find out in the next election, the election after that, what really is going to happen. We've seen some pretty interesting things happen in the last election. I already talked about the paid workers working in my riding, and that's the first time I've ever seen them that I can recall in all the elections I've fought. So it shows you that there's a shift away from volunteers into paid workers. And if you don't have the money to pay the workers, you won't have a chance to win the election. It's that simple. If you can't buy the literature, to mail the literature out and do these things, well, maybe it'll backfire on the government. Maybe people will get upset enough that they'll contribute money to the other parties legitimately, and indeed have the money to put into place, you know. So, you know, we talk about that, and I've already talked about the NDP getting that $45,000 that we know about that was quickly buried. You know, we don't forget those things as time goes on, and people don't forget those things either. So it's going to be interesting for our backbenchers when they, on the other side here, when they go knock on the doors, and hopefully you kept your careers up, and your past careers, because you're going to need them. And, you know, my honourable colleague from Cape Breton South was very accurate. He's been here longer than I have been. And he's seen the coming and going of all the different MLAs, the ones that figure they can't be beaten and they can't move forward, and everything their government is doing is the best thing can possibly happen. But like I say, the backbenchers are not government. Only government is executive council. And former member of executive council, you would, if you ever become an executive council member, which I doubt, you'll understand how the system works. And as time goes on, you'll find out. You can chuckle all you want, but that'll be interesting to see after the next election who's chuckling, and it'll be interesting. So people in Nova Scotia are very tolerant people. They'll listen. They'll put up with a lot. But when they get mad and they get upset, and when they get upset, they don't forget. They got a long memory, and indeed, they will remind you on a continuous basis when you knock on the doors the next time. They'll remember about this bill when the advertising comes out that's not controlled. Hopefully, we don't have attack ads in this province. We don't need those to stoop to that level. But we go through all this process and see what's happening. But you know, as time goes on and we see the effects of these bills and what happens with the bills, it could be serious or very serious things happen in the province. And you know, we got a lot of people over there smiling. Smile all you want. I was sitting on that side of the house, and we were smiling too and thinking, everything is great, and everything wasn't great. When the next election came around, and the following election was even worse. So when you look at those things and see what happens, you got to be careful what you legislate, what you promise, and what you do, and what you put in place, because indeed the day of reckoning does come. And when the day of reckoning does come, you'll remember it, but you'll wonder why. You just remember the words I'm telling you today. Because you better heed, because I've gone through the whole process and several times, and I've probably run in more elections than most of you will ever run in. And
order, please. If I could remind the member, to address his remarks through the chair. I've given you a little grace on the use, but let's just pull it back together. We're addressing the chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'll keep that advice. So you know, as we move forward with this bill that's being pushed through the legislature, and we see what's going on and what's happening with this bill, and we've seen other bills the last session, bills brought in the last minute, shoved through, and you know, we got the Residential Tenancy Act as another act that's caused a lot of controversy and a lot of difficulties. And it's going to be interesting to see. I've got very few landlords in my riding, but I can tell you the ones I have are very upset. And when you look at what impact that bill is going to have, I think you're going to see the cost of rent go through the roof, because a lot of landlords are going to sell their properties off and get rid of them. It just shows what an effect the bill has. And when this all goes through, I'm hoping that the minister, you know, I've sent some comments in from some of my constituents that do have properties. I'm sure the minister will take those in consideration when he makes the regulations, and maybe when the regulations are put in place, it won't be too bad. But at this point, the way it sits now with the bill the way it is, it's not going to be positive. And don't think that at the end of the day, if you get tenants in that the landlord can't deal with, and indeed they don't pay the rent or destroy the property, that it's not going to cost the next tenant when the time comes. But that just gives you an example of an effect that a bill can have. And this bill, as my colleague from Dartmouth East said, this is probably one of the most important bills this legislature's dealt with, because this goes right down to the foundation of democracy. And when we look at democracy and how it affects us in this province, I mean, we have a plaque on the wall over there. You know, we celebrated just a short while ago the 250th anniversary of democracy in Nova Scotia, the first democracy outside the British Empire, outside of Great Britain. It's quite an accomplishment. And in this very building, the freedom of speech was established. That is followed pretty well all over North America now. And when you look at those things, and you look at a bill like this, and you wonder if there's a possibility this bill may take some of that away. And that's a scary thought. And you know, the way we look at it, and you know you can go to and vote and not be intimidated to vote, and not worry that your vote isn't being manipulated in some way after you vote. So indeed, whomever you voted for doesn't take advantage, of that of the vote that was cast in their favor. But I'll give you another example of things I've seen on election day. We've seen workers that were hired by other parties as deputy return officers that couldn't read or write. Now, in election day, that's a pretty important skill to have. Now, there's other jobs that an individual could have done, but indeed, during the election day, caused all kinds of problems. And indeed, did end up that some of the votes weren't qualified properly, and it did make a minor adjustment in the outcome of the election. But it could have had a major outcome in the election at that time. There's just a few of the things I've seen over the time in elections. And it makes you wonder, as you go through the process, if the law isn't strong enough. The penalties, there was no penalties really in the law before. You could pretty well do anything you want. And if you got away with it for 6 months, then you were sort of forgiven and it went away. And so when you look at the whole process, it makes you wonder why this bill is being shoved through so fast. And when you read through the bill and you check the bill, there's a lot of issues in the bill that I can see loopholes in right now. Never mind when you join an election campaign and you really get into a tight spot, somebody gets in a tight spot and says, well, we can do this, and we can do this under this act, and we can get away with it. It may not be kosher, but at least we can get away with it. And that's happened over and over in election campaigns. So you see that happen, and sometimes it does make a difference in an election. Sometimes it doesn't. Hopefully it doesn't in most cases, but sometimes it does. And you see this process go forward. So it's important that the bill is done properly. It's done to the best interest of Nova Scotians and to the democratic process. I'm not sure this bill at this forum does that. When you have the chief electoral officer in the province looking at this and said, I need more time to look at this and see if it's practical, the person that actually controls the elections. And it makes you wonder what is wrong with the bill. And we've spotted and talked about many things that we feel that are wrong with this bill. The things that have to be readdressed, maybe minor wording changes, maybe some things totally need to be addressed in the bill that would need to be amended. And as we go forward with this discussion, we're going to put some amendments forward on the bill. And those amendments hopefully will address some of the issues. Hopefully the government will consider those amendments, because the amendments are put in with the intention of making the bill better for the people in the province, and better for the chance for people to vote and make sure that their vote counts and does indeed make a difference on election day, and people feel that indeed that they have made a difference. One of the big issues is getting people to turn out election days now, because they say, I've heard all kinds of different stories and about why people don't want to vote and why my vote doesn't make a difference. And when you talk to people, I've told them many times, I said, if you want to make a difference in Nova Scotia politics, you should go help a candidate. Don't have to help me, but help a candidate. Work with a candidate, get the candidate elected, and that candidate sits in the legislature. And if they work hard and they do the right things for the community, we'll get some things changed. They will get some things improved. And hopefully, collectively, we can get things improved for people in Nova Scotia. We've got to admit our taxes are way too high in this province. And as you see an exodus of businesses and individuals, the people in the province are going to start to realize that indeed we do have a serious problem. In discussions in estimates, I asked the minister about Minister of Economic Development and Tourism about tourism, and he gave me some excellent information, which I appreciate very much. But he also said that our tourism is flatlined. And if we look at our Canadian dollar and see what's happening there, it makes it more attractive for people to leave the province for part of the year and travel to the U.S. Things are a lot cheaper in the U.S. And I can give you a couple of examples. I had the opportunity to travel south this year. It's the first time I've ever done that, actually. But you see the cost of some of the things. I remember going into a building supply store and I purchased a can of spray foam that you put in your home for $2.98. That's the same can of spray foam here, and that was with no tax on it. And then they didn't charge tax in that state. The same spray foam here with $9.95, the exact same thing, plus you paid 15% tax on top of that. So it makes you wonder why people are traveling south from this province and other provinces of Canada when our dollar is par, or even when it's below par with the US dollar, because it costs so much less. Again, I was talking to my friend, and he said he bought a turkey at Thanksgiving time for $7. $7 for a turkey. Turkey here is $40 for the same turkey. So it makes you wonder why people want to stay in this province. That's why it's important that we really review these bills and we do the right thing for the province and make sure that the province gets the best service that they possibly can out of the parties they elect, the people they elect, and indeed work towards that goal. But it's a world market now. It's a global market. And we buy, you know, go to the store, it's hard to find something that's made in Nova Scotia. And even, it's just as hard to find something that's made in Canada. If we're fortunate, we'll buy something that's made in the U.S. At least we have trading partners in the U.S. But 90% of the time now it's made in China. So when it's made in China, that's employing people outside of this continent, and indeed it doesn't add anything to our economy. So, you know, if we don't set the bills right in this legislature, make it so we can get people that care about our province and our country get elected, not somebody that just put their name on a ballot and shows up at a constituency after they're sworn in as an MP, for an example, and think that maybe they ran for the wrong reason or just ran for a joke or whatever the story must be. They get the realization what kind of workload and what the requirements are of an MP. Never mind, it's tough enough being an MLA. An MP's got to be a whole lot tougher with representing, you know, 3 to 4 to 10 times more constituents than you do as an MLA. It's important that the Election Act and the acts such as this are put in place, that they properly represent what this country is about and what this province is about. So there's many amendments that have to be made to this bill to ensure that we have a fair election process. No matter who wins the election, it does matter, of course, I belong to a political party, but all political parties, but it's important that we elect the right people here. And indeed, if a party puts a better platform together, a better group of candidates, and they run the election on a fair process that all parties do, then they deserve to win the election. But if the balance is tilted in any way by an Elections Act that could make a change, then we all lose. The province loses, we lose as residents, and we lose as MLAs. The fact that we might possibly see something like that happen. So I'm sure that this bill will be pushed through by the NDP and as we go forward, and we will again remind Nova Scotians that another bill put forward by the NDP that doesn't really help our province in a whole lot. And we see the effects of the Residential Tenancy Act that's changed. There's the MOU that was changed with the municipalities, Bill 100. And there'll be a long list before this government finally decides to pack it in, and the people of Nova Scotia realize they made a huge mistake in the last election and decided that they've had enough of this party, the NDP party, and decide that they're going to re-elect another party to run the province. Well, I can tell you, after being in '93 and cleaned up the mess, helped clean up the mess that was left in before 1993, there's going to be a bigger mess when the NDP leaves next time, and all the things that have to do to resolve those problems. So hopefully, the Election Act will be fair enough, and they will consider some of our amendments, and that will make the act better. And I can't understand why my colleagues from the PC caucus aren't talking about this. And maybe there's been some kind of arrangement made with the NDP. I don't know. Maybe there's a coalition running there. So we'll have to see and check and see what's going on there. But I would hope that they wouldn't do that. But you never know what happens in politics in Nova Scotia. So probably some. Getting your alders cut? Well, there's some hope there for a coalition, getting some alders cut and some of the. So we see a potential coalition. Once they start denying it, it must be true, you know. Oh, it's awful, you know.
Order, please. The honourable member for Preston has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. But I notice the NDP is not saying anything about this coalition, but the Conservatives are saying a lot. So there might be something there. Who knows? I mean, a lot of unusual things happen in Nova Scotia politics, indeed. So as we see things go on and move on, it's going to be interesting to see what happens as this bill moves forward and is pushed through. So one thing is for sure, as time goes on and we see what the effect this bill has on the people of Nova Scotia and the political parties in Nova Scotia, another party will be elected, another party will make changes. And as the changes are made, even if this bill isn't changed, and you know, this should be a bill that's discussed by all three parties, and it should be a bill that's satisfactory to all three parties before it's ever passed by this legislature, because it's in the best interest of Nova Scotia to do that. But indeed, when the NDP decides that they don't want to talk about any kind of amendments that we have put forward, it makes you wonder what the goal is behind this. Is it a goal to ensure that the NDP gets re-elected next election because they have loopholes in it? So when this should have been an all-party committee and people outside our parties that look at this act and say that these are good things for the act and these are the things that need changed, and change those things to make it right. Not everybody might have agreed with it, but at least it would have been a process that had been used. A process, I believe, that would have been used for a long time, had been used for a long time. And over the years, there have been a lot of really positive changes made in the Election Act and the election process as it goes on. So we see, as we see this bill move forward, I'm going to turn the floor over very shortly to my colleague here to talk about the merits or her beliefs on the bill. And I'm disappointed that the Conservative caucus or any of the backbenchers haven't got up to talk on this bill as well. And we see, yeah. Oh, yeah. We were listening, but you should speak a little bit more. We'd like to hear what kind of arrangement you made to get your amendments through, or whatever the case may be, to get this done. And but it'll be interesting to see your further comments and see what you think. And I'd be really interested to see what the backbench members of the NDP might have to say.
Order, please. The honourable member for Preston has the floor. If your conversations are that important, perhaps you can take them in the behind. Thank you.
Well, you can tell that once somebody starts complaining, you know you've hit a note with them. And
order, please. The honourable member for Preston has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd be very interested to hear what they have to say. They can take their time here and their place in this legislature and make their comments, and I'd be very keenly interested in hearing what they have to say. Unfortunately, they don't seem to be very interested in getting up and speaking on this bill. Maybe down the road when they go to an election and they see there's a loophole in the election that creates an unfair playing ground for one of the other parties, they might have wished that they stood up here and talked in length about the bill. In any regard, with those few remarks, I'd like to take my seat and let another speaker go forward.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Well, thank you so much, Madam Chair. It's my pleasure to rise tonight and speak on the title. We're here in Committee of the Whole speaking on the title to Bill 59, which is an act respecting the election of members to the House of Assembly and Electoral Finance Act. So there's a lot in that title, Madam Chair, and a lot in this bill. And as I know we've talked about the amendments being large, but imagine the bill, you know, right now with the amendments included is 134 pages long. It's really a book in and of itself. And there's a great deal of detail, as can be appreciated in a bill this size. I'm sure that the many lawyers that worked on it and put it together felt that as well. It's been a huge labor to bring this together in what is described as being more user-friendly language. It's supposed to be more updated, a little modernized from what we had before. And I can tell you, as a member who's sat in this legislature almost 8 years, it's still a pretty difficult read. It doesn't read all that easily as you go through. And it's even harder, Madam Chair, when you look at the 18 pages of amendments that were presented last week, I believe on Thursday, that they came through. And 18 pages of individual clauses, change this word for that word, delete one word and substitute something else. It goes on and on with different paragraphs that have changed, re-lettering that's gone on, the addition of some provisions now on third-party advertising, which is really why we're here and what we're looking at. Most of it is really very obtuse, Madam Chair. It's not easy to read, and you have to really go through it carefully. And that's our point, is why is this act important? And well, I can tell you, for the Liberal Party, the reason that the members of the Liberal caucus are getting up and speaking at length on this bill is because we believe it is important. And I can tell you, I wouldn't be here tonight doing this as well if I didn't think that ample time should be allowed for us to digest this and for us to turn to the experts who actually are very knowledgeable in this. And that isn't any of us here in this House. I can tell you that. This is very specific, very detailed, very difficult material. And it takes the people who are really expert to go through and look it over. And our biggest problem here tonight is that the expert in this province is the Chief Electoral Officer. And the Chief Electoral Officer said last week that she had only seen this on Thursday last week and couldn't give an opinion on whether or not these provisions are really adequate, or whether or not some of the wording might create other problems, or whether there are unforeseen difficulties that will come from the way that these amendments have been very quickly, Madam Chair, you know, really brought to the floor of the legislature. You know, a number of other members have spoken about this legislation essentially being rammed through. And I think that is, you know, a pretty accurate, illustration of what's going on. It's being rammed through at record speed. And I can tell you, over the years, and I know many of the members can relate to this, there's been a sense after, you know, say 6 weeks of the House and the budget's passed, of ramming through the last pieces of legislation. And they just go down like lickety-split, one after another, rolling through Committee of the Whole, being voted on in third reading, just bang, 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 and no time for discussion because we want to get out that day or the next day, and everything's just rolling through. Whereas in the earlier part of the session, we actually are talking about the bills, looking at their content, paying close attention. By the end, there's this sense of urgency to get out. And I don't hold with that at all, Madam Chair. I think that we have a job to do, and if it goes longer and it requires more discussion, then we need to work on it. And, you know, many people have said that politics is the art of the possible, really, of working together. I think that is the quote, the art of the possible. Looking at how you can get to a win-win situation, bringing divergent views together and trying to find a way that you can satisfy the concerns of all the parties that are here. And when you have a majority government, Madam Chair, it's a pretty different situation, because sometimes you'll end up with it. Thanks. Sometimes you'll look at it and say, well, we've got the majority seats, we can do darn well what we like. And that's what we're seeing here today. We're seeing an arrogance, and yeah, sure, that's right, sure. Yeah, why not? Just flex your muscles and beat your chest too while you're at it, all of you. Let's see it. I'd like to see that. I mean, you're being cavalier about it. You have a responsibility to Nova Scotians and to your constituents to make the best bill possible in Elections Act. That's what I mean. Madam Chair.
Order,
Bill
please.
59. Did I mention it's Bill 59?
Thank you. I would remind you to speak to the bill and to address your comments and remarks through the chair. Thank you very much.
As much as members over there may feel that they've been perhaps baited a little bit in this debate, I can certainly say that I don't like to see members of the government side, particularly cabinet ministers, shrug their shoulders and be cavalier about what's in front of us today. Maybe you need to stay here a few more days and just keep your nose to the grindstone.
Order. I would remind the member again to refer to your remarks, your comments on the bill and through the chair. Thank you.
It's very upsetting, I must say, to see that kind of attitude among, responsible people. And all of us have a big job to do here today. And I'm saying, why are we here today? We're here and we're talking about this bill because the minister himself, who brought this bill in, said there hasn't been any major amendment to the Elections Act for 25 years, and that this act was outdated and that it needed to be brought into line with other legislation. And the Chief Electoral Officer herself had asked us to improve this act so that, she's in constant contact with other jurisdictions in Canada, in the federal jurisdiction, and she knows where the changes have been made elsewhere and how they make for a stronger act, a better democracy, a better functioning electoral process. And that's what we want here now. Why would we otherwise undertake a discussion on a bill that is this long and this weighty if it wasn't because it had a purpose and made a difference in this province? That's why we're here. But if you're doing your homework and you're doing it right, you work with the Chief Electoral Officer. She's the expert in this, right, Madam Chair? She is the expert. Definitely. And that's the person that we want to look to take our guidance from, and I think all members feel the same way. And what distresses me as we look at this now is that after, more than a year of the Electoral Commission meeting, which was had representatives from all parties sitting around the table, working with the electoral officer, putting forth different viewpoints and trying to see how we can have the best act possible before us. After all that work has gone on in good faith, and a bill is brought here that's missing a key component, and that is the provisions to limit and control third-party advertising, which needed to be addressed. And then the government, very suddenly, really, brings in 18 pages of amendments. And those amendments have not been run by the Chief Electoral Officer. They weren't on the table for discussion with the Electoral Commission, which had the representatives of, as I said, all the parties at the table. And those were knowledgeable people who made it their business to study the existing act, to study what other provinces are doing, to be up to speed on all these details. If we have any experts in this province on electoral law, it would be the members of the Electoral Commission and the Chief Electoral Officer. They are the people that we need to hold, I think in high esteem, and to bring into this discussion around these amendments. And my problem is we haven't heard from them, and our Chief Electoral Officer doesn't have the information in her hands long enough to give us the answer on whether or not there are unforeseen difficulties with the amendments before us. And the government would like nothing better than to see this bill passed quietly, to have us say nothing about it, and to, just live with the consequences, whatever they may be later. And why are we so concerned? Madam Chair, we're concerned because we believe there could be things in this act, implications of the wording or changes to the act that could actually be very detrimental in this province. And yeah, we think that in fact there could be an underlying purpose to this, to leave loopholes open, to still allow a lot of funding from unions and other groups that have been very advantageous to the NDP party over the years. My colleague from Richmond went through quite a number of items concerning the funding of the NDP party. He started back in 1998. He looked at a number of individual ridings, but I think what's more important than the individual ridings is to look at the overall contributions that were made to the NDP party, which would fund the provincial election, and they are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars in different elections. Cumulatively, something like over $2 million when we got to the whole cumulative amount. But I can give you just a few of them just to illustrate. And I don't want to repeat what the member from Richmond said, but it bears looking at again. And I think the members on this side of the House certainly agree that there has been a very close relationship between all of the unions and the NDP in their funding of elections and in their, not even veiled support, in their absolutely public support of the NDP, and to the point where all members of their unions are solicited to vote for the NDP and almost bullied into supporting them. And whether they support them or not, a member of a union has no say about whether their hard-earned dollars are that they have to pay in dues to the union. They have no say about whether those dollars are redirected to the NDP party. And I think that's wrong in and of itself. Some of the members might remember during the 2006 election when the person running for the NDP party in my riding in Halifax Clayton Park had an endorsement directly from the head of the NSGEU. And that endorsement was sent out directly to all of the union members who lived in the Clayton Park riding. Imagine that. And it was sent to their homes. Imagine that. Now, if you were a member of the NSGEU and you lived somewhere in the Clayton Park riding, you would have gotten a letter directly from their president, Joan Jessom, urging you to vote for her very good friend who was running for the NDP. And I don't think that was right. I think that's an abuse of the private information of the members of that union, Madam Chair, who certainly their records are available to the union hierarchy. But that isn't the right way to use them. And to send letters, personal letters like that, urging support for an NDP candidate through that union, perhaps using the union money to mail those letters, or the union offices to prepare the letters for circulation. And I know there were members of the union who took exception to that and who raised that with our chief electoral officer and had a complaint before her that that was not a fair way to participate in the election. And that, I know, didn't happen again in 2009 when the same member was running against me for the NDP party. And I think it's because a lesson was learned, and that there are limits to what you can do when you have the control of the information from a union, control of the money from a union. And again, we know that changes were made in the Financing Act, which meant that large donations weren't going forward in 2009 as well. But I wanted to just draw your attention to some of the early donations that were coming from unions to the NDP party in Nova Scotia. And what I find interesting is if you look at the individual donations, they're not even just Nova Scotian unions. They can be national unions, unions from other jurisdictions. We don't know where all these various locals are, but there are locals of this, that, and the other thing. But the amounts are what are quite staggering. I mean, here's one in 1998, which is UFCW District 6. $55,000 to the party. Federation of Labour, $47,000. CAW, so I guess that's the Auto Workers of Canada, $35,000. All of that during that 1998 election. The total that year was $226,000 that went into the coffers of the NDP party to fight the election in 1998, which we can remember was very closely, it was a very close race. That one ended up, I believe, in a tie. And, we look at this year in and year out, thousands, and again, hundreds of thousands of dollars coming from unions directly to the NDP. And so we know the power of third-party monies coming in. One act was amended to stop that, and that was our I think it's the Electoral Financing Act, if I have a look at that. One interesting thing with the Act before us, Madam Chair, Bill 59, is that it has consolidated several other acts. And Bill 59 does cover electoral financing, as well as all of the rules around elections. And I wanted to just look and see which ones have been consolidated. Oh, here it is. It says we've consolidated the earlier Elections Act, which we said has been 25 years since it was last updated in a significant way. It also includes the Members and Public Employees Disclosure Act and the Income Tax Act. And I think it's the Members and Public Employees Disclosure Act, which was the one that dealt mostly with the financing portions. And we remember a few years ago, In fact, Madam Chair, you may remember being part of this, but a few years ago, the same procedure was used as we're doing tonight when the NDP stood up on amendments to that Act about electoral financing and spoke 1 hour at a time, hours on end. And that is a procedure that is quite acceptable in this House and that the NDP have used to advantage in the past yourselves. Right, Madam Chair? Directly to the chair. I want to make sure you know I'm mindful of that. I'm doing my absolute best. But the fact— Very good job. Thank you. I'm trying to be very respectful. Madam Chair, as I said, what we have before us in this giant act here, 134 pages, is that consolidation. And when you read through this act, it is not all that easy to follow. I know it's an improvement on the language, perhaps, but it is so large and it covers so many aspects of really everything that the electoral officer is responsible for, that the running of elections, the reporting of the elections and financing, all of that is covered in here. And the Act is something that the Chief Electoral Officer, as I said, has been seeking because it does a number of things. It changes the very nature of the position here in Nova Scotia, and it's going to make the Chief Electoral Officer an officer of the legislature. And that makes her very similar now to, should this Act pass, to the Auditor General, who we all have a lot of respect for, who has a unique position in his relationship to the legislature, and who, in fact, I have the opportunity, Madam Chair, to work closely with, and as you did as a member of the Public Accounts Committee, because we have, the good fortune of having a very active Public Accounts Committee where the Auditor General is an integral part of that and attends every week to be part of our deliberations, to provide guidance to that committee in terms of the not only the witnesses that we call and the programs and departments that we look at there, but he is there to help guide us in a very impartial, very professional manner. And all of us, no matter what party affiliations we have a great deal of respect for the Auditor General because he does act in an impartial way. And I think that's important that we now see a change coming, a parallel change with the Chief Electoral Officer. And I think that's a portion or a part of this Act that we all respect, hold dear, embrace. So, before we go on too much about the aspect of third-party advertising and the need for it to be addressed and addressed properly, I think it is worthwhile to note that in this large Act, there are many provisions that have come forth from the Electoral Commission, from what I have said are the best minds to look at this Act. And I think, nobody can dispute that because they have spent over a year making themselves very conversant with all of the issues. And many of us have spoken here today, and I'm sure we'll hear from more, about our knowledge as candidates in an election and about what we experience on the campaign trail, following the rules that are set out for us, and they're sometimes difficult rules and require a lot of study and a lot of experience really by our volunteers and our campaign teams in order to really act upon. There's already a lot of provisions to make sure that elections are fair and that they are run transparently, that you can identify who contributes to a campaign, that you can identify campaign advertising. As we all know, if you have an advertisement during a campaign, you have to identify your party. You have to identify that it has been sanctioned by your official agent so that it's clear which candidate has run that ad. And even small things like little pins that you might wear, you're supposed to include on those little buttons and pins some little mention about your official agent approving that advertising. So, even very small things need to be properly identified, and that way there can be no mistaking that it is election material and that it's being used for an election purpose. And so, we've been very, very careful to follow all of those rules, as I'm sure the other members of the House have as well, because nobody wants to be found to be in contravention of those rules. Not only would it be an embarrassment, it's illegal, and it would cast very poorly on any party and on any individual, Madam Chair, to have that occur. Now, I think that is a serious matter, and the stronger and the clearer that these rules are, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. I thought you might be about to speak, but I shall continue. Madam Chair, you know, in the last election, there was a case of wrongdoing that was investigated. At least an official complaint was raised. And I think, again, that it's important for us to remember that and to remember why having a proper Elections Act in place is so important. Because these sort of misunderstandings or loopholes or, you know, finding sort of sneaky ways to make things happen will not be possible if you have an act that's very clear, that doesn't leave anything that's ambiguous or uncertain. You know, that's the worst kind of legislation, when it's ambiguous. And sometimes we see other acts come back here for clarification for the smallest thing, the change of 1 or 2 words that make them clearer and sort of nail down what it is they're intending to do, so that whatever stakeholders are affected by it can then be on a sure footing about where they stand and what's required. But, Madam Chair, I was surprised today to look for the first time myself at the report and disposition of a complaint dated June 9th, 2009 against the Nova Scotia New Democratic Party. And it's a report that was submitted by Christine McCullough. I understand it's on the Nova Scotia elections website. And it's the full report of the investigation of the complaint against the NDP for accepting $45,000, or I guess a single, maybe it was several donations, totaling $45,000 in union donations. And the complaint, as it says here, was first brought in on June 2nd, 2009. And just glancing at it, Madam Chair, I found it interesting. I'm sure all of us have heard the name Kevin Lacey lately relating to the Taxpayers Federation. But this says June 2nd, 2009, Kevin Lacey, Provincial Campaign Director for the Progressive Conservative Association. So it wasn't very long ago that he had a very different role to play in this province. I think right now he is trying to distance himself from that affiliation and say that he is apolitical. I'm not sure that we're all quite there yet to see that. But definitely during the 2009 election, I hope some of us are skeptical as well. I'm not the only skeptic about the role that he's currently playing. But in 2009, he was definitely Provincial Campaign Director for the PC Party, or PC Association, it says, and he filed a complaint letter to Christine McCullough, the Chief Electoral Officer, and it followed that up with a formal complaint pursuant to subsection 28(1). It says of the Act. And so Christine McCullough then went forward to investigate that. And as you can see, it's a very long investigation report too. There's plenty in here. I noticed that KPMG was engaged. That's one of our well-known and international accounting firms. So KPMG had an engagement in order to look into this as well, and they set out what their rules of the engagement were and what they found and their scope of the investigation. And, you know, a lot of work, and I would say a lot of money went into investigating this complaint, and a lot of time. And I really think it's more than surprising, and in fact, it's very disappointing that at the end of the day, when they find that the outcome of this investigation was that there was something wrong done, that was against the Act that was in place, and that $45,000 should not have been accepted by the New Democratic Party. When we find all of that out, nothing further was done because the former Act had a 6-month statute of limitations. And when the 6 months had expired, Madam Chair, you know what happened then. There was no legal footing on which to proceed. And there is an article here that I have that speaks to that. It was March 24th, 2010. It's the Canadian Press. And the headline says, police say time is run out for possible charges in Nova Scotia NDP donation case. Halifax Regional Police has closed its investigation and won't lay charges into questionable donations that the NDP received during last year's Nova Scotia election. The force said Wednesday that the 6-month statute of limitations to lay charges under the Members and Public Employees Disclosure Act has passed. Elections Nova Scotia fined the NDP $10,000 after the party accepted more than $5,000 maximum campaign donation allowable by a union and an affiliate, and because the party didn't return the $45,000 when it said it had done so. And Madam Chair, that kind of history, yeah, I'd love to, yes. Could I table that? Maybe you get me a photocopy at the same time, if you would. We'll table the one that's highlighted. Thank you very much. I think it's very telling. And a lot of us forget, or we were busy on June 9th. We all had an election that we had fought, and in the case of those of us present here, had won. And we may not have been paying as much attention. But I hope that the members of the House can appreciate why members of the opposition, and today it's members of the Liberal Party that are speaking up, why we should be concerned. Because if we don't get this act right, and we don't take the time to make it as clear and as open and as accountable as possible, and if we allow there to be ambiguity or loopholes in this act, then we fail to do our duty in creating an act that's going to take us forward further into the 21st century, further into a strengthening democracy, and we will have allowed, more things that might be shady to take place in this province. And Madam Chair, we don't want to see that, and I don't think any of us do. If the people who work in our party and the people who work for us in our individual campaigns can fully understand the content of the act, and if the training is available and they're able to know precisely what is allowed and is not allowed, you're not going to see this kind of thing happen again. And I'm a believer in that. I don't think that this is something that any party would have looked for. And I imagine the NDP party is embarrassed to have seen that in the press and to have had to go forward with that hanging over their head as a new government when they're feeling very buoyant and excited and euphoric. So, at that moment in time when you're starting off, and somebody else used the word hope, there was a lot of hope that something different would happen. A new government had been elected. What a way to start with that hanging over your head, that you allowed your campaign workers, the people that you entrusted with making the right decisions. You allowed them to go forward on your behalf, and something was questionable, to use the term that I had in that last article. Canadian Press said it was a questionable donation, and somewhere in this very long report from the Chief Electoral Officer, they say it was wrong, but they couldn't move forward on it because of that statute of limitations. And I think that one of the very best things that we'll see in this act before us today is that we've extended that from 6 months to 1 year, so that the Chief Electoral Officer will have time to investigate any complaints that are made and have time to act on them. And that's something that wasn't allowed in the past. So I wonder who in the past let 6 months go by as the length of time that you would have to lay charges. To me, that was rather self-serving, and that if we can change that, that's going to make sure that everybody does things right in the future. And I think that's the sort of thing that we're looking for today, and why we're saying this act matters. And it matters because it sets down the groundwork, the foundation for our democracy. Madam Chair, we live in a country certainly where it's a privilege to have many rights, but we also have some responsibilities, and one of them would be to take an interest in government and to take our role as citizens and hopefully to vote in those elections. And I know that some of the changes in the Act are intended to make it a little bit easier, to take some of the obstacles out of the way that might prevent people from voting. And I know that some of them are to do with if you're not in the riding at the time. There's a very long process about getting an absentee ballot. I think you have to mail back and forth about 3 times. First, your desire to get the ballot, and then your proof of who you are, and then they send you a ballot and it has to be mailed back. So if you don't start this process very early, it just doesn't happen. And I know there's also the issue around many people who are shut-ins, who might live in seniors complexes or living alone and have difficulty getting out. There's difficulties with people who might be disabled. And Mr. Chair, those sort of changes make a big difference for people, I think, going forward. And the Act now talks about having mobile voting stations And I think that's a very big positive as we go forward. I wanted to find the exact description of that. But the idea, I think, is that a voting station can come to you, to your home, for example. If they know in advance that you need help, they will come and allow you to cast your vote then with that support. So I think it says here, it's basically improved access to voters and enhanced voting options. That's what it says. And Mr. Chair, I certainly would hope that we'd be looking at some more modernization in terms of using electronics and perhaps getting to an electronic voting system. Certainly that's been in place the last 2 elections with HRM, and that's our largest municipality. As you know, more than 40% of the people in this province live in HRM, and they have had faith and confidence for 2 elections in online voting. And I think that members of this House certainly know that I've spoken for a number of years about how frustrating it is that we don't even recognize online petitions here. And that the government, in fact, the previous government, used the tool of online petitions to pressure the federal government, but didn't even take the steps necessary to allow our parliament, our legislature here, to accept those petitions. And I think there's a challenge here for all of us to hopefully see that Assembly Matters Committee meet, which dictates how our province or how our provincial legislature works. And let's get together and talk about the changes that are needed here to modernize our own legislature and the way we interact with the public and our citizens. And I think by so doing, we'll have a lot more interest in what we're doing here at the legislature and more means for people to participate. And certainly we've got to be moving in the direction of online voting. I think that there's no 2 ways about it. But what we do have in this act, when we talked about improved access, is it says that it improves the convenience and increases opportunities to vote during the election. And they referred to something new called a continuous poll and also extended advance polls. And again, advance polls have only been open very specific days, just a few days before an election. And this will allow them to be open, I believe, right from the advance poll time through to the election day. And that will be an improvement as well, because otherwise people may find they're left out. On the continuous poll, it said that the former act provided for a 6-day special poll. The continuous poll will enable voters to vote at any time during office hours at the returning office up to the start of the advance poll. So that means you'll have both the advance polls and the special poll going back to back, and that's going to allow more opportunities as well for voting. Mobile polls are going to be permitted, as I said, and they'll be able to go to residential centres like seniors' homes, long-term care facilities, homes for I think even shut-ins. I think they'll go to individual homes based on the briefing that we had from staff who have helped write this act. And I think that in itself is a big improvement. I think that there's been some talk about wanting to have on the Electoral Commission a representative from the community representing the disabled. And I hope that that is something that will go forward from the government. I think that's a very reasonable suggestion, and we should look at that as well. And that's the whole reason why, Mr. Chair, why we need to talk in this legislature around the specifics of bills, because they're not cut and dry. No bill seems to come that's got everything in it that everybody believes will make it a stronger bill. And if we listen to each other, we can often make it better. And if we listen to people at law amendments, we can make it better. And as you know, Mr. Chair, we had the Chief Electoral Officer present at law amendments, and the chair of that committee did not allow her to answer all of the questions that were asked. What we did find out at law amendments, though, was that the Chief Electoral Officer did not have ample time to review this, and that the government, much to our surprise, the government hadn't worked these amendments out with the Chief Electoral Officer, that somehow they'd been worked out in a back room with a few people who thought they know it all, I guess. But it wasn't members of the Electoral Commission, and it wasn't the staff members from the Elections Nova Scotia that were sitting in that back room. And so we're left to wonder just whose brilliant ideas it was and how it came to be and who chose the dollar amounts for third-party advertising. You know, was this picked out of thin air? What was the formula? How did we decide what's a reasonable amount? And what are the implications of the changes that were presented at law amendments, that the Minister of Justice said that he would bring in these amendments representing third-party advertising, and brought them in without really the approval, without seeking first the approval of the Chief Electoral Officer, which you don't need her stamp, I know, you don't need that. But at the same time, Mr. Chair, at the same time, all of us would like the comfort of knowing that the biggest expert in this province, the most astute person when it comes to electoral law, would have been informed and would have been able to give an opinion. And if she could give her blessing to these amendments, it would be a great comfort to us, because then we would know that the other perhaps unforeseen outcomes, the loopholes, and perhaps the ability to leave open doors that will allow less than stellar election activities, perhaps questionable election activities, perhaps even activities that are wrong, that are just plain wrong. And the door is left open unless we know that the experts have looked at this and said that they don't see any unforeseen difficulties. And because of the length of the Act, as I said, 134 pages in this Act, and now when we're reading it, we've got sections blocked out and new sections added in. That's not something that you do on the fly. And if you do, you're not running a good government, because that's not the way government should act and enact new legislation. If you want to be proud of the work that's happening, Mr. Chair, we all need to work together, government and opposition, to be sure that the acts that pass through this legislature are going to do what they're intended to do. And in this case, it should strengthen our democracy, not open it to abuse, and not open it to loopholes and to self-serving, possibly self-serving clauses and means. And we worry about that, because I've read to you just recently, and I tabled a document that referred to the trouble that happened in 2009 during the election, which was an illegal acceptance of $45,000 in campaign donations by the NDP government, or by the NDP party, in funding that election. And Mr. Chair, we find that troubling, and I know that what you want, or what government wants, what we all want, is to be sure that this Act is transparent and clear. And one of the things I was very pleased about, Mr. Chair, was that the new Act is going to allow for the Chief Electoral Officer to do more training. And under the education and communication sections of the Act, it's going to do a couple of things, but I like the idea of training programs and guidelines for volunteers, and that would include people like our official agents, and they handle, as you know, the campaign donations and the recording of that information, issuing of receipts for tax purposes, reporting to Elections Nova Scotia all of the donations that we would receive. And that's a very important role, and it's become increasingly onerous. We've talked a lot about volunteers, and the volunteers that help our parties, and that some parties, notably the NDP, have paid for many of their election staff and people working on the ground. In the Liberal Party, we have not done that, and we find that we have volunteers working in all of these positions. And I know that the job of the official agent has got to be one of the most onerous, because their work is ongoing through a campaign, as they, as we solicit for donations, as we receive donations from individuals, Mr. Chair, because there are severe limitations now on corporate, I think that corporate and union donations, and the large amount of union donations that I was referring to would not be allowed under the present Act. So, we have to be careful that all those rules are followed during the election. And then when the election is over, and those of us who have won are on to our busy work and beginning to do the work of an MLA and getting back to the work of an MLA if we're re-elected, our official agents are left with the big job of sending out all of those tax receipts and reporting to Elections Nova Scotia. And there's quite a very, I would say, very thorough reporting format and timelines and deadlines that are required to do that. And so we have a lot of respect and certainly a lot of thanks, each and every one of us, to the official agents who will take on that job for us. But the new system under this Act will allow the Elections Nova Scotia themselves to offer training programs and guidelines for volunteers like our official agents, the electoral district associations, which we would call our riding associations, and all of the people involved in election campaigns. And the purpose of that is to improve the understanding and the compliance with election rules and regulations. And as we get more training, people will know exactly what is and is not allowed. But remember, that's all in the context of the act that's going to be passed in this legislature, and that's Act 59, which I'm speaking to, as you know, the new electoral act. And so, Mr. Chair, we feel that that would be a positive thing. I'm also pleased to see that the act is going to now allow young people 16 to 18 years of age to come and work as poll clerks and election workers in the actual voting stations. And I think that's a wonderful way to start engaging younger voters, younger people. They're not yet able to vote, but maybe if we get them engaged and they see the process firsthand, they may in fact vote when their time comes. We know that with young voters under the age of 25, I think it's about 20%, maybe 1 in 5 cast a vote in the last federal election. I don't know if they've tallied it from the election that was just this month, but certainly it has been in the last number of elections a very small percentage of young voters and first-time voters that take that opportunity and that responsibility seriously and cast a vote. And I think we need to find ways that we can involve young people and allow them to see that every single vote counts. And certainly we've talked a lot about strengthening democracy, which is part of Bill 59, but when we talk about that, we need to do something, because our turnout at the polls is frankly, very disturbing. And in my riding, which is the most populous riding in the province, I don't know if you are aware of that, Mr. Chair, but I have the largest population of any of the ridings. I have a very high density riding. I have 2/3 of the residents of Clayton Park are in multi-unit buildings, and 1/3 live in homes or townhouses. So you can appreciate that we have a more mobile population in Clayton Park because it has a very high percentage of renters, much higher than the Nova Scotia average, because we have a high average of home ownership. But in my riding, it would be predominantly renters rather than homeowners. And for that reason, it's often young people who are just starting out, who might be there because they're students or because they are new in the city and haven't yet got into a position to buy a home or to decide where they'd like to live. So there's a lot of mobility and a lot less connection overall to the riding. They may not have lived there long, and they may not have those roots that make them more active in the riding. And therefore, I know that all 3 parties worked very, very hard in fact, 4 parties. The Green Party had candidates there the last 2 elections. But all of us work hard to get out and to contact people in every corner of the riding. And I do a significant amount of door knocking in the apartment buildings as well, because I believe that everybody has the right to hear from their candidates and to get to know them and to make a choice that's based on knowledge and information. And so it's important to me that access is there, and I know it was in the old act and remains there in the new act, that we have the authority to go into multi-unit buildings and into condominium buildings. That's important, and I'm pleased to see that remains there, because as a municipal councillor and running in a municipal election, in the past that was not the case, that there was a requirement to give access to candidates. I believe that's been corrected now in the Municipal Government Act, but I think it's very important that we allow that people that happen to live in multi-unit buildings should have the same access to people campaigning as others. And again, as I say, we have a responsibility to do just that. But my point around it is that we had a very low turnout in the Clayton Park riding. It was one of the lowest in the province in 2006. It was below 50%. I think it was in around 48 or 49% range. A little bit up in the last election, but not much. We're still hovering around 50% turnout at the polls. And I think we want to find ways so that we can engage the young voters who are traditionally not going. And as the leader of the opposition said as well, we want to make sure we're touching the older voters, because when you have a history of first-time voters not exercising their franchise, that means that they're getting older and still not voting. And we're finding people quite easily that are in their 30s and older, and our parents and our homeowners, and they're still not voting. So we need to find out why they are so disengaged. We need to do more as a province. And I regret to say that the work done in Democracy 250 just didn't do it. We spent money, and we had people going out to schools, and the speaker visited all over the province, and the two co-chairs visited all over the province and spoke to young people and held concerts on the Hill. And the next election was held in 2009, and there was no change in voter turnout, and there was no appreciable difference in young people's voting. So somehow, Mr. Chair, we missed somehow we missed having an impact in that regard. I think that celebrating our unique position as the first responsible government in British North America, outside of England, we were the first. I think that's very important, and I think it's a source of pride. And at the 150th anniversary, they built the Dingle that's in the Purcell Cove area. That was actually done as a historic site. It's been in the last couple of years named as a National Historic Site. That's the Dingle Tower, for those that don't know it, but sitting along the shores of the Northwest Arm. And in this last 250th anniversary, we have, well, we instituted a number of celebrations, but we haven't left a monument, and we haven't made a mark really in terms of the turnout at elections, which I think is really a great sin. And we're not doing our young people any service by that. You know, I wanted to go to the issue of the Electoral Commission and their work around third-party advertising and the need for us to control third-party advertising. I talked about the what I think was a travesty that occurred in the 06 election and was again an embarrassment to the New Democratic Party in that election. In fact, I think might have had certainly played a role in my being re-elected, and perhaps helped other candidates, because it showed very clearly a very close tie between the unions, the union donations, and the NDP party. And as I said, it was a direct endorsement, a union endorsement of a candidate in an election. And again, there was a complaint during that election that was made in 2006. Speaking to Bill 59, the issue in 2006 wasn't an advertisement, not in the sense that it was broadly based. It wasn't a billboard. It wasn't a pin or I guess an electoral advertising, but it was a union endorsement, and it was using personal information to contact union members with their own money and really abusing their personal information. And why didn't it happen in further elections? Because it was wrong, and because it was an embarrassment to the NDP party, or it would have continued, and that's a fact. It would have happened in this last election more broadly than it did. And you know, as I say, it's an embarrassment, whether or not it's a loophole or not. There's right and there's wrong, Mr. Chair. And the members of this House know the difference between right and wrong. And you know what? It's not a war, Mr. Chair. It's not all's fair in politics and all's fair in love and war. It's not a war. It's a democracy. And in that respect, we have to act responsibly, and I think play by the rules. That's all we're saying over here. Play by the rules and make sure that this act and the 18 pages that have been thrown at us as amendments, Mr. Chair, make sure that that's playing by the rules. I'd like you to tell them to be quiet. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I appreciate your support in that. Mr. Chair, as I said, there's this urgency to get out of the House. It happens every time. It happened for years under the Conservative government, that the day the House was supposed to rise, everybody gets hell-bent for leather, as they say, to get every single act passed through here, lickety-split. Don't take a breath, don't look at it, don't ask any questions, because it's time to have the Lieutenant Governor come in here and read us a long list of bills that have just passed, and how pleased we all are to say that we've passed all these bills. Sometimes, I must tell you, Mr. Chair, they are bills that we didn't even need to have. They're bills that are pretty inconsequential. I remember one time when the NDP was so thrilled to get one of the private members' bill through, and it allowed you to turn left on a red light when you went from one one-way street to another one-way street. And that was heralded as the biggest win. Oh my gosh, it was a big win. And you know, every time I turn left from one-way street to another on a red light, I remember that. I remember the member who brought it forward. And you know, I must say, you know, we like to have bills pass. Everybody does. It shows that we're making a difference, I guess. Now we've got a bill that allows us to, it's been proclaimed, allows us to defer to buses if they need to pull out into traffic, and that's going to be helpful to bus drivers and transit. And I hope the riders on buses will appreciate it. It'll make it faster. But sometimes you could do these things in other ways. You can do them because they're practical things. You could do them through just changing a rule or a policy. But we like to bring them in here, and we like to make it look like there's a really long list. And Mr. Chair, when I say we, I don't mean me, because I've had the privilege of serving in opposition. I have not been on the other side of the House where we've run through all these bills and made it look as if there was a lot more work done here than there was in fact done. And I just wonder if the members remember how quickly we love to get these bills through. And that's why there's a lot of angst today, because people don't want to stay here and hear a lot of talk about the Elections Act. But I'm afraid that it's necessary. And the reason we're here is because this act is the foundation of our elections. It's the foundation of our democracy, and it needs to be done right. And we need to pull ourselves out of sort of a more backward state and make sure that the act that we have in place is modern and meets the standards of today and can stand up next to any other province's act, and so that we can be proud of what we put in place, and we can help the people that are going to be part of the elections to know precisely what the rules are, and no more no more gray areas. Let's call it that. Let's make sure that that's gone in the future. But what's missing in this whole picture is that we haven't referred to the people who know it best. We haven't heard from the Chief Electoral Officer, who could do her work and come in here and tell us that it's right. And at the Law Amendments Committee, which unfortunately I was not sitting on, Mr. Chair, she was in the room and did not have the opportunity to be prepared in advance to know what the implications are of this bill. I mean, you have to sit down with lawyers, Mr. Chair. You have to sit down with lawyers who look at how this works, and she knows the implementation of this better than anyone. And so I don't know whether she's been told to be quiet. I don't know whether she's busy studying this act. I don't know why she's not able to tell us or tell government that these amendments meet her standards, that they're going to stand up against other acts across the country. So really, is she gagged? I hope not. She's going to be a person who represents this. Well, why can't we have that? She's gagged. That's right. Good point. That's true. I mean, I realize people feel that may be going a little far, but, you know, it seems like any officer of this House, Mr. Chair, officers of this House who have spoken out against the government or not worked as closely as you might like, or perhaps weren't as malleable as you might like, have found their way to the door pretty quickly. And I think that that's a real shame on this government as well. And, you know, again, under circumstances that are not altogether clear, and with severance packages that, you know, were not made public when they should have been, and, you know, at considerable expense to the government. Let's make sure we know that. And I know the Minister of Finance is very conscious of that and very aware of monies that are spent in such a way. So we need to make sure that all of the members of this House and all members of the government appreciate why this is so important. And one person is too many to show the door to. One is too many. And at a very great cost, and you all know who we're speaking about too, and so do members of the public. It's not right at all to see people that are officers of this House and charged with a duty to be treated disrespectfully. And that's why I'm asking why we haven't heard anything publicly from the Chief Electoral Officer, and why we don't know for sure what the implications are of the changes that are outlined in the 18 pages of amendments that were thrown at members of the opposition in the 11th hour of this government. I wish it was the 11th hour of this government. It's the 11th hour of this sitting. So I can only wish that it was the former. Right. That's right. Well, we wish. But anyway, we certainly know that everybody is anxious on the other side of the House to see this discussion finished, and we are not anxious to see it finished. We're anxious to see this done right and to be done responsibly. And I'd like to know why the government can't look for a win-win in this situation instead of being partisan and in fact stubborn, and using a sort of meat cleaver instead of finesse that might mean you can work together. You're trying to hammer home what you want. You did the same thing with Bill 17 that we talked about last week. You couldn't wait. Pardon me, Mr. Chair. The government couldn't wait a moment. They couldn't just catch their breath and talk to pharmacists and work that out. They had to move forward. And again, as I said, you know, all the while patting yourselves on the back or beating your chest or, you know, being proud of yourselves because you have the power. You have the power with Mr. Chair. Government has the power, Mr. Chair. It's difficult because there's so many people that I'm looking at. But, Mr. Chair, I understand we're not allowed to use the word you. And I'm working very diligently. I'm going to try that again. But what I do feel is that when government has the numbers as we do now in a majority government, you should still use it responsibly. And you should still be looking as a government, Mr. Chair, to make sure that there are compromises and wins as we go forward. I think that that's what's very important. I think the other members, in fact, are frustrated because they're stuck in their seats and they can't get to their feet and they're not allowed, and so you natter and you complain. And many of you enjoyed being in opposition because you had a voice in opposition, and now you're silenced. I said that, pardon me, Mr. Chair, that the silence of the backbenchers is deafening, and their voices have been taken from them, Mr. Chair. And I think that their frustration is being reflected today in a rather loud house, and perhaps a little bit of impatience in terms of sitting here and listening to the opposition members of the Liberal Party alone, I might add, asking for some action on this. And we know there's some kind of kissing cousins arrangement. Mr. Chair, there is some kind of arrangement going on between the government and the Conservative Party. We're not sure. We'll just say you're kissing cousins. I don't know. But do you know what? It doesn't take any of my resolve. I am still full of resolve in terms of questioning this bill and wondering why the government would have the audacity to throw 18 pages of legal amendments to a bill at members of this legislature and expect us to just say yes. Just say, yes, it's fine. Well, how can we possibly do that in all good faith, in all good conscience? And what we're asking for is that we hear from the electoral officer, that time be given so that we can be sure that there are no loopholes, no gray areas, no sneaky business, nothing like that to happen. Welcome, Mr. Chair, new chair. There we go. I seem to be wearing them out here. I've had 3 chairs since I started, so I don't know, I must be doing something right. It's all talk, it's all talk.
You can't heckle from that seat, right?
Anyway, thank you. 3 chairs for the member. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. As I said, Mr. Chair, there are elements of this bill that I am very supportive of. Perhaps, Mr. Chair, you could tell me how much time I have left in my...
About 5 minutes.
Very little time, so it's a good time to make sure that I've hit on all of my important points and that it is clear why I am concerned this evening about Bill 59, the new election of members and House of Assembly to the House of Assembly and Electoral Finance Act. And my concern goes to the fact that I don't feel comfortable that I can trust the amendments that were provided to me, and that in fact, without hearing from the experts, which are our electoral commission, which are made up of 9 members of the public that represented all 3 parties here in the legislature, if we don't hear from them and they haven't had an adequate time to study it, then I think this bill should be held back until the fall, and that the 18 pages of amendments, and as they are now integrated into this act, be studied by them, and that we hear back from them, that each of us either hear from the electoral officer or we can hear from our representatives on that electoral commission. And that's a very reasonable request, Mr. Chair. It's a request that says, why can't we all feel that we've done the best job possible in looking at this new Elections Act and in supporting the electoral officer who has been asking for this to come and has been working so diligently to ensure that we have a modern electoral act to guide our future and our democracy. If we don't do that, then we've made a mockery of the whole Democracy 250 and our pride in being the site of the first democracy outside of the government. We really have, Mr. Chair. If we don't do our best to ensure that this Elections Act is the best it can be, and I'm not at all comfortable in supporting 18 pages of amendments that have not been studied by lawyers or looked at carefully. And I think nobody else on the government side should be either. And those silenced members on the other side of the House, Mr. Chair, I think they may feel some distress that they can't get up and speak on this act, but the fact is that all of us have a responsibility to do the best that we possibly can to increase voter participation, to increase the public's respect or confidence in our elections, and not to see something that's less than perfect go forward. What we need is to support the Electoral Commission and the Chief Electoral Officer in making that position a proper I guess, representative to this House rather than the current situation, to give it more independence and autonomy to that role, and to recognize the expertise that office holds. And I think that is what we should do. We should hold this back. There is no urgency, and the government should realize there is no urgency to see this passed in the spring sitting. We will wait, we can study it, and everybody can go forward in the fall with great certainty that we've done the best that we possibly can. Mr. Chair, I appreciate the time I've been given today to speak to the title of this bill. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the honourable member from Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's quite interesting, Mr. Chair, that we're here on a Monday night and towards what we all hope to be the end of the session, and there's such a ruckus atmosphere. It would lend one to think that we might want to take some more time, that there may be some real important issues that we might want to address. However, we are here tonight and we're discussing Bill 59. Mr. Chair, it was 1 year ago that I had the opportunity as an opposition member, as an independent member, to question the Premier's office at that time during the budget debates. And I recall the very first question that I gave to the Premier, and it was kind of a lob ball. It was a question centered around basically the first year, the first budget of the new Democratic Party. And the line of questioning was centered on the fact that the opinions of many Nova Scotians were around the divide that had been created, the discontentment of the folks that, and actually if the member from Hammonds Plains, I'll let him understand this is my preamble into my discussion. So if he would like to make a comment, he can stand as well. He does have that opportunity, Mr. Chair. But Mr. Chair, my comments were centered around the divide that I had seen, and many Nova Scotians who had approached me had spoken to me about, the fact that the Yarmouth Ferry had been cancelled in the first year, the unemployment rising in Cape Breton, the discontentment around the jail announcement in Spring Hill, the cross-border shopping that was happening in Amherst because of the HST and the gasoline pricing. And I asked the Premier at this point, how did he see his party and his government bringing this all together? Because when we're going through an election, what the people of this province want to know is that our leader and our government has a vision. And it was a tough first year for the New Democratic Party, and here we are a year later. We're in another session, another budget, their second real budget. And if we want to talk about and touch on some of the issues that again, we've seen Nova Scotians being very critical and legitimately concerned about, Mr. Chair. We've seen recent budget cuts with the education budget. And, of course, that falls on the backs of the school boards who make the decisions based on the funding that they receive from government. And that's, that's how government would put it. That's not our decision. They give the envelope of money and the school boards make the decision. And Mr. Chair, there were some real tough cuts, and we haven't seen the last of the discussions or the concerns of Nova Scotians and parents of young children. We'll hear about the education cuts and the impact, the direct impacts of those cuts in the upcoming fall session when children go back to school. We've seen the debate around the fair drug pricing. And I had made a statement last week when I was discussing this to the effects that I believe if the government party does not negotiate fairly and recognize the work that our pharmacists put in to running their business, to adding value to our communities and service to the healthcare budget, that I believe that this government, and again, I'll state that the same statement that I made last week, I'm holding out faith that they will negotiate properly, equal pay for equal work. But if they don't, it will be a black mark on this government. It will be a black mark because this government has tried and made an effort consciously to embrace the business community over the last number of years. In the fall, we've seen the discontentment around Bill 100. Again, this spring, we see the cancellation of the Voluntary Planning Committee, a committee that was struck up over 50 years ago, and it was an opportunity for that committee to talk to Nova Scotians about the contentious issues that might not have been on the side of government or in favor of the government. But we've seen a cancellation of that. We've seen another contentious issue, Mr. Chair, around the downloading of funding to the municipalities when it comes to housing, education, and correctional services. We also seen this spring with the budget coming in, we've seen the user fees being increased, Mr. Chair. And again, you know, when in opposition, the NDP had made statements that this was a hidden tax. They had criticized government parties at the time because they didn't bring it to the floor of the House to discuss this and the importance and the reasons why. But this year, the second NDP budget, we've seen them bring in and raise the user fees. So, you know, the first year was tough. You know, they've got their feet wet. We're into the second year, Mr. Chair. And there's a real bubbling effect amongst the electorate, some real concerns. And despite some of the good things that have been happening, I can tell you in my travels in Halifax and throughout Dartmouth that there is some real concern as to the direction or the vision that this current government has for the people of Nova Scotia. So that brings us, Mr. Chair, to Bill 59 and the real reason why we're here tonight. And Mr. Chair, if we think back, why, well, obviously there's a question as to why it's taken us 22 years to even address any concerns with this act. However, it is here, and I think people need to know and understand why we're discussing this and why the legislative changes have been implemented, and now we have a series of amendments. And the reasons why, Mr. Chair, is it goes back to the 2009 election. And quite simply, the Liberal Party at that time, partway through the campaign, had made a formal complaint to the Chief Electoral Officer around third-party funding with the Canadian Union of Public Employees. And at that time, you know, when you're midway through a campaign, Mr. Chair, when a complaint comes out, it can really derail, you know, a central campaign. And at that time, obviously, there was what many have said was an orange wave coming over the province and sweeping through. However, a little jolt like this and the other two parties in opposition making the alignment of the unions really struck a point with the New Democratic Party. And I find it odd that the Minister of Justice who brought this in his quote, when he brought this bill forward to the media, had stated, and I'm going to quote this, Mr. Chair, he said, "To me, the issue of third-party funding was more concerning to a lot of other stakeholders than to me personally." Well, you know, I find that an odd comment coming from an individual who was obviously running as a candidate in that 2009 election, a part of the New Democratic Party who had been criticized. To make a comment like that is quite, well, it's questionable. It's questionable as to whether or not, does he actually get this? Does he realize what happened here? Does he realize that after that complaint went in by the Liberal Party that the chief electoral officer at the time, in the fall, had actually come out and said, we need to address this now. We have legitimate concerns. And based on his drafted legislation, she had seen fit to make recommendations, very strong recommendations, Mr. Chair, in and around third-party funding. So the comment that the minister made on the Friday after he brought this bill forward was, kind of made you question whether or not he had a real sense of the importance of this legislation. But of course, we're here today because he did, Mr. Chair, because that bill was brought in on a Friday, and on Monday, we were told, those other members in the House were told that there's going to be a number of amendments coming forward, and that's what we're discussing tonight, Mr. Chair. 18 amendments that were brought to us today. And Mr. Chair, I know it's been talked about by a number of members here today. I came to the House tonight, put a full day in at the office. I came here tonight, and I've seen the expansion of the act, or the bill, the 134 pages that are now on the desk with 18 amendments. And Mr. Chair, to be quite honest with you, I've only recently, in the last number of hours around this debate, been able to really look at those amendments. How could anyone possibly sit here and say that they fully grasp it, they fully understand it, without taking the time? Mr. Chair, there's something else that happened during that campaign as well, and that was a campaign that the NDP had really picked up on the Obama moniker of change, and they were going to do everything different, and different than it had been, and it was time for a change. What Nova Scotians had said to the New Democratic Party was, what? It has been too long of a time, and we're going to give you a chance. We're going to give you a chance because you have experience. You have members who have stood on their feet in the legislature and spoken to media about issues that were important to the people of the province. They had the foundation of MLAs who knew what needed to be changed when it came to getting to that side of the House. But during that campaign of change, Mr. Chair, we also seen, what we found out later to be some illegal campaign contributions. And the member from Hammonds Plains, Upper Sackville had stated to the member from Clayton Park, no, it wasn't around advertising. But a year later, the findings of the Chief Electoral Officer last February, seen a fine of $10,000 come to the NDP. And subsequent to that, we've seen a member of the NDP party, the provincial secretary, treasurer, Ed Wark at the time, did what many people had said, which was take the bullet for the New Democratic Party, the now Premier. But that's okay, Mr. Chair, because a part of that change was seeing Mr. Wark later on being employed by another company. He's done quite well for himself, and he's gone over to Cherubini Metalworks, who, this year received over $20 million. $4 million last fall and another $15.5 million. So that's part of change, Mr. Chair. But what came out of that 2009 campaign was the combination of the unions and the power of that third-party advertising that we're here talking about today in Bill 59. Another thing that came out of it as the NDP campaigned on change and what we've seen transfer over from the Obama administration, or what they wanted to see change, what we have seen is a lot of similarities to what has been done in the past, and that's what Nova Scotians don't want. And if we're honest with one another, and I know there's been a lot of criticism to the backbenchers tonight, I know that they have to go back to their communities. I know they had to go back on the weekend. I know they had to go back in the last 2 weeks. And perhaps they have a local pharmacy, local pharmacist that they know, that has known them for a number of years, or just recently a young person moved to that community. And I know that they've had to listen to the complaints of that pharmacist who just wants to know that this government, that this NDP government that was campaigning on change actually understands and gets it, gets what they're dealing with. But again, they're unsure, Mr. Chair. So that campaign in 2009 saw the third-party funding come out, and that's what's really, really pressing about it, Mr. Chair, is that, you know, this could lead to, you know, American-style politics. And we've said this, we've seen it at the federal level as well with the attack ads in the recent campaign. And I can tell you just in my own riding, in my own constituency, Mr. Chair, that, you know, the folks that I represent are good, honest, hardworking folks. There's a portion of them that don't understand. If I was to sit down and try to explain the Bill 59 to them, they wouldn't have any idea. All they want to know is, when do I vote for you next time, Mr. Singh? When do I vote for you next time, Trevor? But what people have to understand is that if we don't rein this in, like the Chief Electoral Officer said, we are running the risk of going to high levels of potential attack ads, unfair, unlevel playing fields. And I know that Nova Scotians don't like that. You know, we've often said in this province that Nova Scotians don't vote in parties, they vote out parties. And I also can tell you that in the 2009 election, some of the attack ads by the Conservative Party towards the NDP towards the Conservative Party, and again in 2006, if you go back, I remember one particular ad around the then Premier MacDonald fiddling. Nova Scotians, they get that, but they don't want to get it. They don't want to see their tax dollars going towards that negativity, because we all, you know, sign on the dotted line, put our names forward for nomination and candidacy with the best interests at heart for our communities that we represent. Mr. Chair, the minister brought this bill forward. There's some good aspects in it. When we talked about the younger voters, future voters, we talk about the discontentment with the overall electorate. But when we put something into this bill centered around having our younger folks participate in the democratic process, you know, that's a good thing. That's a really good thing. And if we go back and we look at how we run our campaigns, you know, when you're a candidate, and you know, I think back just recently to the last federal election, the most recent federal election, and you know, the candidate, the new Democratic candidate in Quebec, who had her name put on the ballot and didn't expect to win. And you know what? Congratulations to her. She's taken a lot of heat. But that, you know, is that the democratic process? When you put your name on, you know, it's probably the biggest popularity contest that you're ever going to be involved in your life. So you should understand the responsibilities that come with that. When you're running a campaign, Mr. Chair, you know, as a candidate, speaking as a candidate, and I guess tonight I'm going to speak to future candidates that might want to enter into this, what I call game, this blood sport that we participate in. You know, the candidate comes out, they're told to knock on doors, not to worry about anything else. But if the rest of your team don't get the 134 pages that are in this, and let's say they happen to win, but there's a problem down the line, you know, it throws a real juggernaut into the process, a real frustration. This is a lot to digest, the act itself, but then to come in and add 18 more amendments today, amendments that, you know, again, the Chief Electoral Officer had suggested that she didn't have proper time to evaluate this. We in the opposition haven't had proper time to really understand the implications of the various amendments to this act. When we look at running a campaign and the amount of individuals that are involved in running a campaign, the efforts that we as candidates and our teams put forward to get voters to vote, It is a daunting process, Mr. Chair, as I know many members here know. In the last election, I know that, it's been talked about the NDP's practices of flying in individuals to work on their campaigns. Yeah, that was done, done on a number of occasions. And, there was a number of MLAs in the Dartmouth area last election that were told, you know what, you're going it alone. You won by a certain margin, you don't need the help. Well, Mr. Chair, I'll tell you, that's fine. And even if you're a veteran of politics, you still need to build that base and that knowledgeable base of people that fully understand what they're getting involved in. Because that's the last thing that a candidate wants to do, is to be knocking on a door and at some point during the day be taken aside because there's been a call from the Chief Electoral Officer about an offense or something that had been said or a leaflet that had been put out. That's very frustrating, because you're basically putting your whole life in a variety of people's hands. And there's a certain trust factor that everything is going to be taken into account. During the 2009 campaign, probably the first time in many years, maybe first time ever, we've seen the direct impact of third-party funding. The real possibilities of how this could really get out of hand. And I know we've talked in the past. The members in the opposition, in the government side, have chirped up around the trust funds. The Liberal Party, in the 2009 election, we've seen the third-party funding and unions really take a strong role in the campaign. And was that fair? Well, it was ruled on that it wasn't. So this is a way that we need to keep things in check, Mr. Chair. That we really need to get a handle on this. And one of the things that's probably missing in this, and I mean, again, it's a large bill, and with the new amendments, maybe I missed it. I'll definitely go through it again. But one of the things that the Chief Electoral Officer recommended was that there would be fines and penalties in accordance to the third-party funding. And I might have missed it. I'm sure if I have, the minister will let me know. Or again, when I take some more time, whether this gets passed or not, I guess I'm going to have to find out. But I think that the Chief Electoral Officer makes a valid point in there. If we put that clause in there and we're limiting funding to $2,000 to constituencies, $10,000 overall, what happens when a third party goes over that amount? So we're leaving that up in the air right now, to my knowledge. We're going to push this through. And, Mr. Chair, I guess what we're going to do eventually, if that happens in the next election, after the next election, we're going to come back and we're going to correct it. I remember when, I believe it was 2007, Bill 117, I had an opportunity in opposition to stand and speak for great lengths with the now government party, who were opposing a last-minute rush on a bill that was brought forward by the Conservative government. The late Michael Baker, who was finance minister at the time, brought in a bill that seen fit to have changes around campaign financing. And it was a very, very important piece of legislation at the time. Major changes, major overhauls, and we seen a minister at the time who, put his foot down at one point. I remember the then minister putting his foot down saying, this needs to get passed. And where did we find ourselves? We found ourselves in the last week of the session, or what was, running up to being the last number of days, and the minister was pounding his foot saying, this bill is important, we need to get it through. And those who now sit on the government side stood at great lengths. There was a dozen of them that made the front page of the local paper because they were filibustering the bill. And they were criticized by the then government, the Conservative government, for doing so. But those of us in opposition, those that stood with the NDP, believed that this was an important piece of legislation that needed to be debated and not rushed through this House the way that it was rushed through. And I remember, the now Premier at the time saying, no to union money. And I was one of those members that stood and spoke, like I said, Mr. Chair, at great length. And I remember saying about the Premier's comments that I thought that was a bold statement for somebody in the New Democratic Party, especially as the leader, to say that, you know, they were no longer going to take union money. So, you know, the members on the government side tonight, and I know it's part of the process, for people that might be listening at home or visiting in the gallery, they need to understand, you know, why such angst by the government members. Well, you know, I understand that because I sat with them on the opposition side when we filibustered, when we knew that the government had to sit there for as long as we spoke. But we always spoke about the importance of the pieces of legislation. And Bill 117 really hits home for me. It really hits home for me because we honestly believe that, you know what, all members at that time, all 52 of us, were throwing down the gauntlet because we believed that major changes had to be taken into account and brought into effect. However, not with such haste. And at that time, again, because the government had obviously had the opposition members' support at the time, the bill got rushed through, to our disappointment. However, there was some changes. And with those changes that came with Bill 117, Mr. Chair, came a new problem for the New Democratic Party. The campaign funding was capped at $5,000. So the talk in the back rooms was centered around, how do we get around this? How do we get around less support, less financial support from the unions? And the member from Richmond, the member from Clayton Park had taken the time to do some research into the funding years ago that the New Democratic Party had received from the unions, not just locally, but federally as well. So in 2009, with Bill 117 proclaimed and enacted, it became a real difficult challenge for the New Democratic Party to get around this. The $45,000 got them in trouble. They didn't see that coming, Mr. Chair. But the unions, the third party, seeing the third party unions and the funding and the suggestion that unions, as the member from Clayton Park stated, would get involved that greatly into a campaign where they would actually take the opportunity to advertise and solicit their members, use their personal information to contact them. It was a new thing in Nova Scotia politics. And, you know, Mr. Chair, I'll stand in my place and I'll say that, you know, as a former member of the New Democratic Party, I probably benefited at some point from some of that. However, when I look back at my financial contributions, and the member from Clayton Park talked about the 2006 campaign, where she ran against a former union leader, I can tell you that my campaign didn't receive any union money in 2006. Because all the union money from Dartmouth North went over to the Clayton Park area to help that individual hopefully overcome, which obviously today, another election later, we see the member of Clayton Park still standing here. But that getting around that $5,000 cap that came out of the Bill 117 legislation posed a real problem. So, you know, was it a backroom deal? You know, I can't say for sure, Mr. Chair, but, you know, if we just point it out quite simply, and again, I'll go back to the change. Where's the change? What part of change has this government brought? Is it a new style of doing business? No, not really. When I see the connection between the newly elected MP in Dartmouth, Cole Harbour, the connect with the Irving family, the purchasing of $40 million worth of land in 2009, a subsequent loan of $20 million to Irving and the shipyards, which is greatly appreciated because we have local jobs. But then I see the connection with the now newly elected member of Dartmouth, Cole Harbour, who also, Mr. Chair, happens to have ties with Cherubini as well as Ed Wark, who had taken that bullet when the $10,000 fine came out of the 2009 campaign for the NDP. Where's the real change in that? I don't see it. And to be quite honest with you, there's many who I've spoken to over the last year after that first budget of the NDP who have come to me and said, you know what? I'm not quite sure what part of change they don't understand. And what we have here is, you know, it's great. We have an NDP government, a large majority, who came in 2009 with a mandate of 4 years uninterrupted to take the people of this province in a direction that they really believed that they were going. And as I said in my preamble, Mr. Chair, the issues that we've seen over last year, the first year of the new Democratic Party, and now the contentious issues with a lot of the cuts, and we talk about living within our means. We get that. Nova Scotians get that. But when we talk about job creation and the economy, and then we're cutting education, there's a message being sent there, Mr. Chair, and it's one that Nova Scotians just aren't getting. One, they're not getting, and two, they never expected, Mr. Chair, from an NDP government. You know, when I see the cuts, and again, the government will stand in their place and they'll say, it's not us that made the cuts. It's the school boards that made the cuts. It's not us that will raise the taxes in municipalities, as many of the mayors have said. We just told them we cannot commit to this agreement based on our financial and fiscal responsibilities today. But the reality, Mr. Chair, is that we have put it in those people's hands, those individuals' hands, those school boards' hands who have had to, based on the envelope of monies they've received, they had to make drastic cuts. And I guess for the public and for those of us in opposition, what we thought we were going to get as part of that change was a real vision. Where do you see the education system going? And when I see a program like Pathways cut, when I see a program like Pathways cut in HRM, all right, and I had an opportunity to step outside the chamber tonight and hear Don Claremont speak about crime and our youth in the city. And then I see a program that those members who've been around here since 2006 during education budget debates had stood in their place and complimented the minister at the time for this program. And when I see a school board have to be challenged with cutting a program like that, yeah, those of us, Mr. Chair, when it comes to Bill 59 and we talk about who we elect and why we elect them, Nova Scotians stand in their place and say, well, where was the government's opinion in this? Does the Premier actually really want to see this cut? Does the Minister of Justice want to see programs like this cut? I don't want to believe they do. But Mr. Chair, again, if we look at this bill and why we're here tonight, where is the change? We're doing the exact same thing as the Conservative government, the Rodney MacDonald Conservative government did. Michael Baker, the former Michael Baker as finance minister, had stood in his place on the other side, and he said this was an important piece of legislation. Well, after 22 years, Mr. Chair, this is an important piece. And to punish us in opposition for taking the opportunity to say, you know what, hold it now. Hold it now. And you know, what's interesting, what's really interesting is that, you know what, there's 4 parties in this House, Mr. Chair. There's 4 parties in this House. And there's 52 of us that need to get along, need to cooperate, and we need a government, especially with a majority. And this is where, you know, it was mentioned earlier, and I'm not going to, I don't want to believe it, but there was a word mentioned, I believe by the member of Clayton Park who suggested an arrogance of a majority government. I don't believe that. I believe in the sense that, you know, there's a lot of good members on that side. A lot of good members that add value to the government. There's a question of how big their voices are, absolutely. But when they go home tonight, when they go back to their offices after this session, I'll tell you who they have to answer to, Mr. Chair, and it's directly related to Bill 59. They have to answer to their constituents. And the member from Cape Breton South, I know, you know, for as many years as he spent in his house, you know, he made some early predictions I believe he made some early predictions last fall. I expect him to make some more predictions in the upcoming fall session and again next year. And he'll make those predictions leading right up to the budget. But, you know, we're here, Mr. Chair. We are here for Nova Scotians. And Nova Scotians want to know that part of the change that the NDP campaigned on 2009, that the funding that come from the unions and third-party funding was put towards a different way of doing business, a different way of conducting ourselves in the House of Assembly, a cooperation when it comes to ideas. And I remember the now Premier years ago saying there is no monopoly on good ideas. But we have members and sitting ministers who are criticizing those of us on the opposition side who are just saying, you know what, whoa, there's not going to be an election for at least another 2 years. We can get this right. We can get it right now. Let's sit down. As been stated earlier in some of the remarks in passing by the Minister of Justice, tell us your ideas. Well, I came here tonight and there was an extended version of Bill 59 on my desk, which included the new 18 amendments. And Mr. Chair, quite simply, I have concerns. But because we have a majority government, they have the power. And you know what? That's what Nova Scotians voted for. And if we look at a lot of the things that have taken place, the issues, the contentious issues, the education cuts, the fair drug pricing, the cancellation of the voluntary planning committee, when we look at these contentious issues this year that the NDP are facing, and we go to the comments in the local papers and on the blogs and on the internets, we look at what people are saying now, Mr. Chair. And they are saying, where is the change? Well, after 22 years, we have an opportunity to get it right. We rushed this through, Mr. Chair. I'll tell you where we'll be. At some point down the road, during the next election, somebody will do something, a campaign will run into trouble, somebody wouldn't have read or understood the amendment. The Chief Electoral Officer will, I believe, honestly, will be sitting back saying, you know what, I seen it coming. But we passed this through during this session of the House. When do we bring it back? When do we find that out? 52 MLAs sitting here as legislators, we have that opportunity. We have that authority that's been given to us by the electorate to do this right, to not bring it back after the next election, and the next government sits on that side and says, we need to look at this. We're going to bring in a piece of legislation, but it's going to be what we call a housekeeping bill, because something wasn't done right. We didn't fully understand this clause. And now that another political party's been embarrassed by it and outed by the Chief Electoral Officer, we need to address this. And we'll be right back here again, some of us, discussing those very points. Mr. Chair, you know, when I became an independent member last year, I remember receiving many phone calls and many emails that said,